Hi everyone, and welcome to our summary on the properties of water. What we're going to be doing in the video today is having a look at the specification reference all about water, its properties and how they relate to living things. So hopefully by the end of this video you'll be able to explain how hydrogen bonding occurs between those water molecules and then relate that to the properties of water and the roles that water has in living organisms. Now do note that as far as the specification goes, it also tells you that you need to include a range of roles that relate to the properties of water, including, and it actually lists them for you, solvent, transport medium, coolant, and as a habitat, and illustrated using examples of prokaryotes and eukaryotes. So you can't just talk about one creature is what it's telling you here. You need to know both prokaryotic and eukaryotic examples. First thing that we're going to have a little think about as far as water goes is what water is. We're going to go right the way back to the basics. Hopefully we know the very basic, that water is made of two atoms of hydrogen covalently bonded to a single oxygen atom. So you can see the little diagram bit down here on the right hand side. Now, one thing that's going to be going a little bit further than you've done at GCSE is understanding the fact that when we've got this oxygen bonded onto those two hydrogens, then what we actually find is we get a bit of an uneven distribution of electrons. Now, the reason for this, if we think about the actual number of protons found in oxygen, it's got 8, because it's obviously atomic number of 8 on a periodic table. Hydrogen only has a single proton in its nucleus. Hopefully we remember from our GCSE chemistry that protons have a positive charge. So to all intents and purposes, what we're doing is we're saying we have 8 positive charges up here, but only a single positive charge in each of the hydrogens. So what we have is a much larger positive charge in the oxygen than we do in either of the hydrogens. Hopefully we remember electrons have a negative charge and opposites attract. So what happens is that those 8 protons in the nucleus of the oxygen are going to produce this stronger force of attraction to those shared electrons that make up the covalent bond. Because remember, in any of these covalent bonds, that's a shared pair of electrons. So rather than sitting dead centrally between the oxygen and the hydrogen in each case, what we see is that stronger force of attraction towards the actual nucleus of the oxygen atom means it's going to pull the electrons closer to the oxygen. So we get this uneven distribution of the electrons within the molecule itself. As a result of that, we end up with what we refer to as a polarized or a polar molecule. What we've done is we've given our oxygen this slight negative charge because the electrons have been pulled ever so slightly closer to the oxygen. So it has this slight negative charge. And the way that we'd write that on our diagram is we'd use the Greek letter delta, lowercase. And then because it's going to be a negative charge on our oxygen, you'd have the little negative sign. So delta negative just means a slight negative charge. For our hydrogens, because the electrons have been pulled closer to the nucleus of the oxygen, they have this slight positive charge in each case. So we use our little delta sign to show slight and the little plus to show it's a slight positive. Because we've got slight negative on the oxygen, slight positives on the hydrogens, then we have a polar molecule. It has slight negative and slight positive regions. It is polar. Now that phrase there, describing water as being polar, is kind of like the key chemical property, if you like. If you remember no other chemical properties of water, remember that one. Because quite often you'll find you'll be able to pick up a mark on an A-level paper for actually writing that water is polar. Obviously, if the question's asking for that, not just on an unrelated question. Because we've got these delta negative and delta positive regions on each water molecule, what we actually find is that different water molecules are going to be attracted to each other. because opposites attract. So the delta negative region on one water molecule will attract the delta positive region on a different water molecule. And as a result of that attraction, we get this weak electrostatic bond forming between them. And that weak electrostatic bond is called a hydrogen bond. Please be careful here, because all too often on these A-level papers, you will see students writing down that hydrogen bonds are strong. They are not. A hydrogen bond itself is a weak bond. Again, one of those key chemical properties that you can get a mark for in a number of questions. So hydrogen bonds are weak bonds. If we wanted to show it on a diagram, we can see we've got two water molecules at the bottom, and this little dotted line that goes between our delta negative oxygen and the delta positive hydrogen, that is a hydrogen bond. So we just show it as a dotted line rather than the solid line of a covalent bond. So what we're going to do then is we're going to have a look at some of these key properties of water and how it relates to living organisms and their ability to exist, full stop. So first property on the list is the state. If we consider water itself, then at room temperature and pressure, water is in the liquid state. If the substance is in that liquid state, that tells us that the particles are able to flow over each other. So we've got this ability for movement within the substance itself. Because we've just said that water has these hydrogen bonds that have formed between the different water molecules, then in order for those individual molecules to move around each other, we need this constant breaking and reforming of those hydrogen bonds to allow that to happen. Why can it happen? Because hydrogen bonds are weak. That means it doesn't need much energy to break them. What you may work out from prior knowledge and just general knowledge is that an awful lot of these simple molecules that are a very similar size to water, so think carbon dioxide, oxygen, nitrogen, etc., they're all non-polar molecules. However, they're a similar size to our water. The key difference between them is water is going to be a liquid at room temperature and pressure, whereas those are going to be gases. Why? Well, the simple answer is hydrogen bonds again. The reason our water tends to remain a liquid is due to those hydrogen bonds that are formed between those water molecules. Because in order for that water to become a gas, we'd have to break the hydrogen bonds between all of those molecules of water. Obviously, in order to do that, we need to break a large number of hydrogen bonds, and that would then need a lot of energy, which means we'd need a higher temperature to achieve that. So at room temperature, we don't have enough energy to break those hydrogen bonds. Therefore, water stays as a liquid. Property number 2 is the density of water. Now, density is important because the actual density of water in relation to other organisms gives them their ability to float. So what we find here is that because water has its very specific density, then a number of organisms are able to float within it. If water was less dense, then those aquatic organisms would just sink to the bottom. Now, it's quite problematic if an organism just can't float in any way, shape or form and just is stuck at the bottom of a pond. Therefore, it just wouldn't work for life. So the density of water means that our aquatic organisms can float and therefore they can survive in that water environment. When we consider what happens to substances as they cool down, ordinarily, as we cool down a substance, its density increases the cooler it gets. Water is weird. Initially, as we decrease the temperature, then yes, the density does increase. But that is only true until we get down to around 4 degrees Celsius. So the density of water will increase as the temperature drops down to 4 degrees. If we keep decreasing the temperature beneath 4 degrees, then what we find is those water molecules are going to start to line up in this very specific pattern because they're going to form hydrogen bonds between those delta negative and delta positive regions. So that very polar nature of the molecule once more comes into play, because that means we're going to end up with our little water molecules all lining up in a very specific way. So what we end up with is this little setting here, and you'll have to excuse my not great diagram drawing skills. We end up with, obviously, little hydrogen bonds, the little dotted lines, forming between the individual water molecules. Because of that, they're going to be held out in a slightly more spaced out fashion than they would be in a typical substance becoming solid. That means that as our liquid water turns to ice, so as it goes from liquid to a solid, then it actually becomes less dense. So that key phrase to remember is that ice is less dense than water. Because of that, it's going to float on the surface. Whenever you are using this as an answer in a question, don't just write ice is less dense than water. Always follow it up with therefore it floats. So why is it important that ice floats? Well, because if our ice is floating on the surface of liquid water, then first of all, we're going to still have an environment of liquid underneath it. So those aquatic organisms that live in our pond, our lake, whatever, if we've got ice on the surface, we still have liquid water underneath. So they will still have a habitat to live in. That ice on the surface is also going to act as an insulator, and that protects the water from that extreme cold. And it's going to reduce the rate of heat loss from the liquid water underneath. So it provides a more temperature stable environment than if the ice wasn't there. And finally, one that's always a good one to throw in when we're talking about ice, it provides a habitat for creatures like polar bears, penguins, etc. So I know it sounds a little bit crazy that you could get marks on an A-level paper for saying that polar bears live on the ice, but you do in some cases. So just remember, in terms of the importance of the density, ice floats on the surface because ice is less dense than water. That means that underneath we still have a liquid environment for aquatic organisms to live in. It insulates the water and it also provides a habitat for organisms like polar bears. Our next property is the solvent property of water. Now, water is described as a very useful solvent because it can actually dissolve both ionic and covalent solutes. So what we find here is this is going to be able to dissolve a wide range of different substances that we may need transported in different organisms. The reason it can do this is that because water is polar, that means we've got delta positive parts that would attract to a negative part of a solute, and delta negative parts attract to a positive part of a solute. Because of that, we then end up basically surrounding the solute molecule with the water, and therefore it will dissolve into a solution. The reason that having this ability to dissolve a wide range of chemicals is important is because that means that we can then transport a large number of substances around organisms. If we think about one particular region of our cells, the cytoplasm, that's more than 70% water. So because of that, we can move a large number of ions and molecules around within the cell itself. Our next property is cohesion. Now, again, we're coming back to water being polar and its ability to form hydrogen bonds between the water molecules. When that happens, and we've got our little water molecules all with their little hydrogen bonds between one another, then what we've actually done is got almost like a chain of these water molecules. Now, what we find is anywhere that we've got those water molecules with the hydrogen bonds, we've got this cohesion between them because hydrogen bonds have formed between the water molecules. That means that if we consider the top of a lake or a pond, then we've got this layer of water molecules all hydrogen bonded together, and as a result of that, they're going to have a stronger attraction to the water molecules beneath them than the air molecules above. So what happens is the surface of the water is actually going to contract and create this surface tension. Now, that's going to be very important to us because if we've got this surface tension, when a force of certain size is applied to it, it can resist that force. So if we think about things like a pond skater, then those are little insects that are able then to literally walk on water. So that surface tension means that the insect itself will apply a force that's small enough to allow it to just stand on the very surface of the water. So it can move around on the surface without sinking in. We also find that cohesive nature of our water being very important in terms of our xylem tissue within our plants. Because the water molecules have those hydrogen bonds between the molecules, that means we form a continuous column that will allow the water to be drawn up the xylem and transport those dissolved mineral ions with it. Our next property is adhesion. Now, adhesion is not the same as cohesion. These two are terms that people mix up quite a lot. Please don't, because it's just wrong. It's scientifically incorrect. So cohesion is where we've got water molecules hydrogen bonded to other water molecules, so hydrogen bonds between water molecules. Adhesion is where we've got those water molecules being attracted to something else. And the best example of this is the xylem vessels. So within our xylem, we obviously have the hydrogen bonds between the water molecules. That's our cohesion. But we also have these attractive forces between the water molecules and the xylem vessel walls. So that is adhesion. The next little category of properties we're going to look at are the thermal properties. Now, we've got two key thermal properties that we're going to consider as far as water is concerned. And the first one of these is specific heat capacity. Hopefully we remember from GCSE physics that specific heat capacity is basically how much energy we require to raise the temperature of 1 kilogram of a substance by 1 degree Celsius. As far as water goes, it's got a high specific heat capacity, 4,200 joules per degree C per kilogram. Now, the reason that's so high comes back to the fact that we've got a large number of hydrogen bonds within a body of water. So because we've got a lot of hydrogen bonds, we need a lot of energy to break them. So a lot of the energy that goes in is going to go to breaking the hydrogen bonds rather than raising the temperature of the water. So that means we've got a situation where we've got a really quite stable environment as far as temperature goes, because we'd have to pump in an awful lot of energy to that system to actually raise the temperature even by a small amount. Why is it important that water has a high specific heat capacity? Because in living organisms, so many reactions are controlled by enzymes. And hopefully we remember that enzymes are very much influenced by the temperature. If temperatures are too high, the enzymes denature. If enzymes denature, they no longer have a complementary active site to the substrate, and therefore the reaction will not take place. So having that stable temperature in the environment means that the enzyme controlled reactions are still going to take place. Our second thermal property we need to concern ourselves with is the specific latent heat of vaporization. Now, specific latent heat is just the amount of energy required to change the state of 1 kilogram of a substance. And if we're talking about vaporization, that would be to change from liquid to a gas. Now, water itself has this high latent heat of vaporization because it's got all those hydrogen bonds again. So we need a lot of energy to change that liquid water into water vapor, gas state. And therefore, that means it's going to take quite a lot of energy from an organism to do that. The final property to consider is that water is actually a vital reactant in living organisms. If we think about a reaction we should be incredibly familiar with from lower down the school, photosynthesis, it's one of the raw materials of photosynthesis. As we've already mentioned in our previous summary on the types of bonding, then we also have a reaction called a hydrolysis reaction. In order to split molecules apart, we are adding water to it. So without water, we wouldn't be able to carry out that splitting process. So water itself is a very important reactant in a range of living things too. As always, if there are bits that you'd like to have a look at in more detail, then head on over to our A-level website and have a look at the resources on there. And you'll also be able to find some past exam questions that you can have a go at yourselves as well. Don't forget to subscribe so that you'll see when we upload some more videos to help you with your A-level studies.